Thanks. Just a quick introduction. I'm Chief Security and Trust Officer with Cylance Corporation. Been with Cylance for 2.5 years now. In my role internally at Cylance, I have responsibility for our internal IT organization, our internal risk and security and compliance activities, public policy, a few other things. I've written a couple books. Last one was out last year on managing risk and information security. But a little bit of background about me that adds context to how I view some of this stuff. I spent almost 24 years at Intel before joining Cylance, so I've worked for 2 companies in 27 years. So oddball from that perspective, considering how people change jobs. But I also have an undergraduate in economics, an MBA in finance and accounting, and my first 10, 11 years at Intel was in different business roles, in procurement, in finance, and business operations. And then I got into security, not because that was my chosen career path. I was a mission-oriented guy, and Intel CIO, after 9/11 and Code Red and NIMDA had occurred, Andy Grove was still in charge of the company, and like his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, let's just say he was beating the crap out of his corporate officers to deal with the availability risk issues that were perhaps facing the company logically and physically. And Intel CIO asked me to come run security and business continuity for him. And I was like, well, why do you want me to run security and business continuity? I don't know crap about security. Other than you need a firewall and AV and a few things. He's like, that's fine. He goes, I got a bunch of security geeks who don't know crap about the business. They'll teach you, you'll teach them. And that was, 16-ish years ago. And I've never left the space since then. My last role at Intel was Chief Security and Privacy Officer. So of course, along that path, I put my arms around anything and everything information risk, security controls, compliance related within the company. I oversaw corporate emergency management, had physical security matrixed into me, and I was also responsible for product security, not the features for sale, but trying to ensure Intel's technology and the development of it had the right processes in place to minimize potential vulnerabilities and deal with any repercussions on that. So I threaded together all these interdependent risk issues. And then now I'm at Cylance. But along this path, and I think it was interesting for the keynote this morning, all of you guys go to that? And I'm not to try and pick on the keynote, but there was elements of it that you're going to see in here that I didn't know were going to be in his stuff. But there's, I think, a different perspective and a different lens with which I will comment on some of the things that I heard there, both positive and frankly negative. One of the things that is definitely true, though, when you look at the world today, it's growing definitely more volatile, ambiguous, and complex. It's speeding up. We see this physically, logically. We saw it in the political cycles that have occurred in the past year and some. We're seeing the tensions between nation states, what's going on with North Korea, what's going on with Russia, what's going on even with China in certain things. And recently I did a series of webinars with Condoleezza Rice, Bob Gates, Anya Emanuel, people that have Secretary of State, large, multinational, complex, situational knowledge of things. And we did these webinars talking about the things that were going on in the world, but then again, how does that affect the cyber context of things? And again, it's speeding up, and part of that is because of the technology evolution that we've been seeing and the mass use of social media. And technology, in many ways, and the World Economic Forum this year, in their risk report, talked about technology as both a polarizing function and a destabilizing function. In the World Economic Forum risk report, they also noted that technology and in essence, cyber dependence that we're all getting accustomed to and growing in that dependence is the 5th most significant risk in the world. The keynote speaker this morning talked about climate change. So on that list is climate change, income disparity, the polarization of societies, aging populations, and then cyber dependence across the world as an item. So again, we have to put the challenges, the risks, the opportunities in this context. And again, it's evolving every second of every day. But I'm one of those folks that likes to look at where we've been, where we're at, where we're going, again, to frame things a little bit differently than I think the way in which we see it in the moment, so that we've got different perspective, different points of view that we can look at these things from. If you look at where we've been and where we're at and how things have evolved, and you look at it in a broader spectrum, there's been these kind of epic incidences of technology evolution in the world, starting in the 1700s with steam, coal, railways, and factories. And that created a lot of upheaval in people and populations. It created the rise of significant industries and opportunity, but it also created, in some cases, some disparity in some areas. Then you had the second kind of epic in another 100-year segment where you started getting electrification, oil, gas, mass production, automobiles, and new materials starting to come into be. And that kind of epic, again, saw significant growth and opportunity. And it's not actually that long ago. It was in the 20s that in the UK alone, they only had 10% of the population were electrified in their household. So less than 100 years ago, there was only 10% that had electricity. Right? So when you put this in these contexts, it's interesting. And when you go then into the third range of these macro technological evolutions and social changes that are occurring because of it, you get into the 90s. Now it's true, you know, I grew up at Intel Silicon, and you saw some of that stuff in the 50s. But you really started seeing the significance of change in information technology in the 90s. And if you think of what we've seen with the rise of the internet and the changes in biology and chemistry and the smart everything that was talked about this morning and what it could do for cities, and if you were to put this again in context and you think of the internet as a movie, we'd still be in the opening credits of this 100-year cycle, which is both exciting, but from a risk perspective, worrisome. Because if we carry forward the risk curve that we're experiencing today, it's going to be a different world. On the cyber threat landscape, there's a bunch of ways in which you can look at this stuff. You know, why is it occurring? What is occurring? How is it occurring? Now, the thing that I also, you might notice I don't have in here is who is doing it. And I intentionally leave the who out. I think too often we over-focus on the threat actor and threat agent. We blame China for stealing our IP. We blame Russia for doing all these other things. And I look at it and I go, we're the country who created the technology with the vulnerabilities and manage it with vulnerabilities and deploy shitty security products in to help mitigate the risk that really don't mitigate the risk, and yet we're blaming somebody else. The only thing that we could have 100% attribution on when there's a breach is what control failed, who was responsible for the control, and who designed the control. That you can have 100% attribution on. But instead, we like to go pick on somebody else that distracts from the real root cause of the problem. But when you look at this stuff and you go across all these things, there's numerous possibilities. And what I've always had in my job is the fact that you got to map this out in this messy nature of all these things that could occur. Which are the most likely? What are the common threads across all of these things so that you could get to, again, a real root cause and then clear the clutter and then take the appropriate actions? You know, in the intrusion cycle today, I get a bunch of adversary groups, threat actors and threat agents. A lot of them. They're always going to be there. There's a bit of a dynamic domain on how they're doing things. Are they phishing you? Are they scamming you? Are they getting a candy drop and you're plugging something into your USB? Are you going to a website that is poisoned and you think it's your bank's website only to get the pop-up that says it's your bank, urgently call them, and it's really not your bank, but they're socially engineering you to get you to give them full remote access over that system. So again, they can exfiltrate your identities and do other things. But in reality, when you again peel the onion on this, it's really happening over the web. It's happening because of the exploitation of vulnerabilities in the technology and the lack of control or appropriate control over potential vulnerabilities, and then the social engineering all going after your information assets. But But the thing that I've found over years and years of doing this is that the tools, the tradecrafts, the processes the bad guys use are not all that different. Even Europol, they do an annual survey of all the internet crime in Europe across all the nation states. They publish it late every year, so their next one should be coming out here October, November. But their one from October of last year basically said the boundaries have blurred between advanced persistent threats, the notion of advanced nation state actors, and cybercrime. So they're saying you really can't tell them apart. The other thing that they've said is that in their investigation of all the attacks that they've seen in the past few years, the attacks for the most part are neither sophisticated nor advanced. It's a use, rinse, repeat, recycle. The same techniques are being used over and over and over again. Robert Joyce, who's now at the White House doing cybersecurity there, used to run what was called ATO. I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but I think they're basically the offensive arm for the NSA, the people that we hire to professionally go after other nation states. So our offensive cyber team. He ran that organization for years. In March of last year, he gave a talk at a conference, and he basically said, as the nation state adversary who's going after other nation states, I don't have to use 0 days. Why would I? It's too easy to get past existing security controls and the sloppiness that are in people's infrastructure. So again, who's accountable for that? We are, and the security industry is. Again, you've got this burgeoning battle that's been happening and a growing tension between security and privacy, particularly post-Snowden. I've always had privacy under my purview and my perspective, but a lot of security teams don't. And I think what happens is, again, a divisiveness that starts to occur. Because you need good security to have privacy, but security can go too far. It can collect too much information. And most security professionals, and I would venture to say most of the people out here that are in the security companies that actually are trying to pitch products, most security professionals inside a company and the vendor community are colorblind or tone deaf to privacy. They think if you have good security, you therefore have privacy. And that's not true. There's nuances with privacy. There's the amount of data you need to collect, what you can do with it, who can make the decisions on it, how you manage it. And on the privacy side of it, privacy has its roots in legal acumen. And the privacy side can also, let's say, stay too academic or too ethereal and not be grounded enough in really what needs to happen. And when either side of that equation gets out of balance, it's like taking two magnets. You know, when security and privacy are turned one way, they're perfectly binding. And that's what we've got to design and think about them like magnets. They're different, but they need to interconnect. But if security goes too far, or the privacy side isn't practical enough, it's like turning the two magnets and they repel. Again, that's a design issue. And we've got a level of polarity that we have today, in not only in the US, but I think more broadly in the security and privacy community, because we're at odds with each other versus figuring out how to design them more holistically together. I drew this picture 17-ish years ago. So when I came in, as I said, to run security and business continuity, and not being a technologist by background and not having the acumen in the space in the early days, Intel's view of the security and privacy issues that needed to be dealt with post-Code Red, 9/11, NIMDA, and Slammer, and those type of things was a 2-year effort. Malcolm, we'll give you money and people for 2 years. Go deploy controls and then move on. They viewed it as something that was a one and done. And I drew this picture to explain to Intel's management what I saw as a cycle of a brewing perfect storm of risk. Because you could see the threat actors and threat agents were not going to leave. I could continue to see vulnerabilities in technology that were happening, frankly, because of crappy validation and design efforts on the part of the creators of technology, and obviously brewing into risk issues. And my job was to put in place controls to manage and mitigate those. But I also saw that some of those controls would want assurance. they would want to know Malcolm is Malcolm, and Malcolm system is Malcolm system. Well, the more I collect information to know Malcolm is Malcolm and what his system is doing, guess what? I'm now collecting attributes of personal information, which increases the potential privacy risks. And then you had a growing legal and regulatory thing starting to occur with the California Breach Bill, Sarbanes-Oxley, all those type of laws. And laws generate business risk. And guess who creates laws? Nation states. Well, nation states are also threat actors and threat agents. And so you have this blossoming of these risks that are interdependent and independent things that I all saw brewing 15, 16, 17 years ago into this perfect storm of risk. Now, when I drew this, I never thought I was going to be using it years and years later. But I think I've been right. And we've seen that perfect storm of risk hit us the past 5 or 6 years. But the common core of virtually all the attacks are vulnerable endpoints. Now, it'll be interesting to see with the recent Equifax breach. You know, they had mentioned the open source stuff, Apache, but how did that get through? Was it an externally facing website that somebody gained access to and then pivoted from there inside? Was it somebody inside who clicked on something that then allowed them to find that vulnerability? I don't know. But the vast majority of attacks, the OPM, Home Depot, Target, you go on and on and on. It was a vulnerable endpoint. Somebody plugged in a USB. Somebody went to a website. Somebody opened a document. Somebody clicked on a link. And that's how the vast majority of these things have occurred. Because guess what? That's how we use computers. And again, the thing that drives me nuts about the security industry is the security industry wants to blame the user for using their computer. Let's do the anti-phishing thing and make everybody afraid to click on something. Why the hell did we buy them a computer if we don't want them to open something? And why give them a permanent written warning when the note looked like it came from their manager? That makes no sense to me at all. If a bad thing happens because I opened a document or clicked on a link or visited a website, that's a technology failure. Not me as a person made a mistake because I get 200 emails a day and this looked like it came from my boss with an attachment to review an invoice to tell him whether or not it was okay to pay. But then you got to ask the questions, what's an endpoint? You know, we've crossed this precipice with anything and everything with power is becoming IP addressable. We heard it today in the opening keynote. It's computing, it's communicating. That's an endpoint. Doesn't matter if it's in a data center, doesn't matter if it's in your car, doesn't matter if it's in your pocket, on your clothes. That's a computing endpoint. I like to tell stories, and it was interesting again to hear the opening keynote. And my time in the tech industry has allowed me a lot of opportunity to have a lot of discussions with some cool things that are going on in the world. And again, growing up at Intel and at the heart of Silicon Valley, much like the keynote speaker, I actually believe fundamentally in the core of who I am, in the hope and the promise for technology to connect and enrich lives, to change things and provide social and economic benefit. And along that path, a couple of years ago, I was talking with the CTO of a farm equipment company. And we were having a dialogue about what they were doing and some stuff. And I said, hey, you know, because it was a group like this, and I was talking about enterprise risk, and their head of enterprise risk was there. And I was going through data protection, all that stuff, and they're like, Malcolm, we don't really have those worries. We don't have the information risk issues that you have at Intel. And I was like, really? Okay. I said, are you guys adding GPS to your tractors and farming equipment? Maybe sensors get laid in the soil as it's plowing. You know, it's got a connection for a smartphone, connected to a big data analytics so that way I can improve crop yield and all that stuff and reduce the amount of fertilizer and improve watering. I said, oh yeah, we're doing all that stuff. I said, okay, so you're a technology company. No, we're a farming company. I was like, no, you're a technology company now. I said, if you're doing that, you're a technology company. He's like, yeah, okay, I'll give you that. I said, so how are you dealing with security and privacy issues with that? He's like, well, there's really no security or privacy issues with it. Like, really? And this was actually before the iPhone FBI thing occurred. So a little bit of backdrop before I go to the next slide. And I said to him, I said, are you guys perhaps donating equipment or funding a non-government organization in maybe Africa or Afghanistan or something like that to help with crop yields and deal with starvation and poverty and things like that, or maybe change poppy fields into something else? And he's like, yeah, we're doing that. Part of our corporate social responsibility. It's like, oh, okay, cool. So what happens if a government comes and knocks on your door because they have human intelligence that says that the second cousin of a high-ranking ISIL official goes back to the family farm to help take crops out of the ground, and they have that, and that tractor you've given them has a fingerprint reader, and they have exact knowledge then of that they're on that field, and they want to do a precision bomb with a drone strike. I said, I know who your by default the committing official is the CEO. I said, do you know who your committing official is? How are you going to make that decision when and if they come and knock on your door? Do you want to be even in the middle of having to make that decision? I said, have you thought about it? He's like, I have no idea. I said, you're head of enterprise risk. I said, this isn't an enterprise risk. This is a brand risk. I said, what if this field happens to be next to a school and the bomb goes sideways a little bit and blows up the school and kills 100 kids? And you provided that information. I said, do you want to be in that spot? It's like, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'd certainly hope that under certain circumstances, yeah, we would facilitate and help kill the potential terrorist. But at the same time, that's an enterprise risk issue, an enterprise information risk issue, an enterprise technology risk issue, based upon what technology you've put in place, the data you're collecting, and how it could be used. I said, now, at least in the US, they'd go and ask. Other governments wouldn't. They'd just hack into that stuff and do it. I said, so what's your security development lifecycle and privacy by design for this? And have you architected it in a way that you wouldn't have the answer, or you don't know? They didn't know, and then he was going to kick off a security development lifecycle and privacy by design effort. Gentleman here on your right, June of 2015, actually, let me go back. In February of 2013, the FDA approved an experimental eye surgery with a notion around curing potentially degenerative eye disease. A couple years later, this gentleman, 57, 58 years old, he'd started losing his eyesight in his early 40s. He had the surgery in June of 2015. A retinal implant with this, you can see it's a kind of a souped up sunglasses, camera, video processing unit, graphics processing unit, small operating system in his brain with the concept of providing eyesight back. Now, the cool thing about this was 90 days later, September 2015, he walks out in his backyard one evening hoping to see the moon with his wife. He couldn't see the moon because the dark and light stuff still wasn't making too much. The noise to signal ratio for him to interpret it wasn't there. But after he got done trying, he turned around and saw his wife's face for the first time in over a dozen years. True story. It's written up in Time magazine. That's cool. That's the hope and the promise of technology to connect and enrich lives. Change things for all of our benefit. Just like we were talking about the autonomous vehicles and the climate change and all that, it's this huge opportunity for that stuff. And you go, hey, if we can do that today, think of 5, 10, 15 years from now and a true bionic eye. That's cool. And think of all the people that could have their lives significantly changed because of it. That was the idea to cure blindness. My idea as a threat actor and threat agent is to extort money. If that technology is poorly designed, developed, and implemented, it has the ability to execute malicious code. It's an endpoint. Imagine a QR code in front of it and I can flip bits and I put up the Sony screen and I hold you hostage to pay in Bitcoin to get your eyesight back. That is a probable event if we don't design, develop, and validate these things appropriately, and then post-implementation go that extra mile to further reduce the potential for malicious code to execute. And this is where I'm going to pick on the speaker this morning. One of the things that drove me nuts, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next few slides, is he actually said a couple things. Cybersecurity will catch up. The hackers will get in. That's the type of technology drive that I've seen. There's a psychological phenomenon around the misperception of risk. When somebody psychologically perceives the benefit in something, they psychologically start discounting the risk. I call it the shiny bauble syndrome. They go, ooh, 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 and they go after the cool thing, and they discount the risk. The tech industry has been doing that for years. Every organization that's chasing technology has been doing that for years. When are we going to stand up and actually say, it's got to be done right? Labor Day weekend, article in the San Francisco Chronicle, front page of the business section, I was interviewed, and the headline read, "The Ethics of Cybersecurity." These are ethical and moral dilemmas that we need to start dealing with, and we need to start dealing with now to stop these type of things from occurring. And not looking at them as opposing forces, but figuring them as innovative design challenges. How do you enable the opportunity and come as close as possible to eliminating the risk? And again, I was using a transportation analogy too, which I didn't know he was using one. Again, I talked to a cement company a few years ago. They were laying sensors in roads, which are probably in Palo Alto and stuff, and some of the things they're doing. And I asked the CTO of the cement company, how are you dealing with security and privacy issues? The cement company said, what security and privacy issues? And I was like, well, Boston bombing. I said, municipalities, cities, they've got cameras everywhere to try and go find people, watch traffic flows and all that stuff. And now that I know that they're there and they're going to be used to find me if I wanted to plant a kinetic device, maybe I go put my bomb some other location that doesn't have all of them. But how do I magnify my event? Well, if those sensors on that road and some of the data that we were showing us out here today, if I could play with that data and affect the integrity of it, I could send a signal to your car, to your phone, and say, this street in Palo Alto is backed up, the one that has all the cameras. Head this way and reroute you, and then set off my bomb. So if I can play with the integrity of that data, I can magnify my kinetic event. And so that CTO of the cement company is like, oh, wow, yeah, we're going to have to create a security development lifecycle. He goes, but there's no privacy issues. And again, this was pre-Ashley Madison. And some of the other ones, it's like, hey, two people in a car together, or two people going to the same space. I said, they might be just friends, but in a different context, somebody might think it'd be more. Or two business leaders. It could be with some other open source intelligence, a signal of merger, or divestiture, and acquisition, particularly in the Valley, right? And who meets who. And if you could get that data, what it could mean for insider trading. And so he's like, wow, okay, a cement company that's become a technology company. Yeah, we're going to have to put in place a real privacy by design effort too. Food and beverage. I tend to do a lot of talks with a lot of peers and a lot of organizations. I actually saw this friend yesterday when I was in Arizona. I was doing a talk for a couple dozen peers around how to have a risk discussion with your board. And variety of industries, but one of my peers there, I won't name the company, but let's just say it's a multinational food and beverage company that I'm sure you're all familiar with, said, hey Malcolm, you got it easy. You work in the tech sector, you work at Intel at the time, they get this stuff. And I go, I wish I had, yeah, I might have it a little easier because they understand the technology, but they also have that shiny bauble syndrome thing. And I'm not a technologist, so me arguing with technologists ends up being sometimes a interesting thing. It's like, but what's your issue? I said, you know, don't blame me because you think I got it easier. And he basically said his CEO and board did not care about cyber risk. And this was just a couple years ago. And I'm like, really? I said, that's a problem with you, not them. And it's a problem with how you communicate and how you make it relevant, not them. And so we ended up in a bit of an argument, and I said, okay, let's stop. So what is the #1 risk issue for your company? What would cause an extinction event for the organization, or spend $1 billion in 10 years to recover the brand? He's like, that's easy. I was like, okay, what is it? Is the lettuce tainted with E. coli, or is the hamburger meat gone bad? I was like, okay, great, food safety, I'll still buy stuff from you. You actually understand that's the #1 risk. I said, so what's your problem with having a relevant cyber discussion? He's like, what do you mean? He goes, there's no correlation between food safety and cyber risk. I was like, really? And I grew up in a manufacturing company, not food and beverage, so I drew a supply chain. I said, you don't own the slaughterhouse, do you? He's like, nope. I said, so freight on board there onward? He's like, yep. I said, the cow has an RFID tag. It says what its body weight is, what it ate, when it was born, its heritage, all that stuff. When it gets slaughtered, it probably gets wrapped in plastic, stuck in a cardboard box, got an RFID tag, it's got a barcode on it, and it goes in a truck. That truck has a GPS, industrial control system, refrigeration unit, so all the way through. So how do you know the food is safe? The only way in which you know the food is safe is the integrity of that data. I said, so what's your cybersecurity program for your food safety data? He looked at me and I'm like, you don't, I won't use the word since I'm on tape, blank and have one? I was like, what, have you been focused on payment card industry standard compliance? I was like, check the box on that shit and focus on something relevant. And so then I went threat, vulnerability, consequence, and action. We know the consequence of food safety data and the fact that people could get sick and die. I said, are there animal rights whack job activists out there who might want to save 10,000 cows tomorrow? Yes, that's certain too. I said, and you have no knowledge of the controls around that data and the vulnerability of it. So you can see what happens. We've got dishwashers companies becoming technology companies. Even Oscar Mayer launched a dating app called Sizzle 2 years ago, a dating app for bacon lovers. Think about that. You know, but the real thing is, again, we can't control the threat actors and threat agents. What can we control is how vulnerable we are and how we approach those vulnerabilities in the design, development, and implementation of them. And the basics of all this stuff I've already mentioned. The interdependency with society's well-being is already there and it's growing. And if you think I'm wrong on some of this stuff, the Mumbai attacks in 2008, $2 million of the funding for that terrorist activity came from cybercrime, vulnerable systems that allowed them to make money to then fund a physical attack. So when you look at controls, I try and simplify it, and this is ways in which we can have the better dialogue with our organization. There's 3 ways you control for risk, prevent, detect, respond, and then there's 3 ways you can approach it: automated, semi-automated, and manual. Now what happens is cost grows as you go to manual, risk grows as you go to response. Now, the industry profits from the insecurity of computing, and so most of them economically have no incentive to solve the problem. Think about it. We're mostly stuck in this semi-automated manual detection and response. Detection and response are damage minimization controls. Bad things are already starting to occur. The macro dials you can play with are time to contain. The only way to truly reduce the potential for harm is to do prevention in the design development of the technology and then post-implementation of the technology. So what we've got to do is not follow the normal path and stay in this spot that's the highest risk, highest cost, most liable spot. Now, when I first drew this, people said, hey, Malcolm, you got to redraw this. And I was like, why? They're like, the upper right quadrant's the magic quadrant. I was like, that's the fallacy in this whole thing. That's not the magic quadrant for security professionals in our organizations. It's the lower left. No, I'm not redrawing it. The industry wants us to stay on this treadmill because it makes more money doing it. We've been an industry in motion. We've been led by an industry that profits from our pain. We haven't been leading to solve the core of the issues. And to do that, we've got to get progress, which means having what I call a control philosophy of shift left, shift down, and then push in, because controls are a drag coefficient on people, process, and data. They chew up CPU cycles unnecessarily. And when you have a high control friction environment, what happens? Your users get pissed off, your business get pissed off, and they go around you. adding to risk and adding to cost. Well, guess what? Why do we have a high control friction environment? Because we haven't asked for one, we haven't designed for one, and guess what? The security industry likes a high control friction environment. Why? Because if your users go around you, they'll sell you another solution. So for sustained progress, we've got to deal with this three-dimensional thing and have a control philosophy to drive towards sustained progress. Again, two choices we've got: stay where we are, or take the responsibility to change things. The industry would like us to believe compromise is inevitable. The speaker today, he said, hackers will get in and do bad things. He's accepted the industry narrative of capitulate to the equivalent of digital assault and let it happen. I don't believe in that. I'm never going to give up and I'm never going to give in. What I do believe is that they're getting in because our state of controls is a bunch of crap today. The solutions most of the industry has sold us and profited on us for years don't do what they're supposed to do. And make it worse, the industry, RSA, this year, I walk out of the Moscone Center. The moment you link business risk to a security incident, that's business-driven security, that's bullshit. That's harm to your shareholders, harm to your customers, harm to society. Business-driven security is about understanding the business mission and proactively addressing, through the right control frameworks, the best way possible to manage and mitigate the risk. You know, it made me even more nuts after WannaCry and all that stuff. The top 5 security companies' stock prices skyrocketed. They benefited, yet they sold solutions that didn't stop the problem. How screwed up are we? I believe the attempt to compromise is inevitable. It's a different notion. You know, on the risk side, universal business risk, all face it. Public sector is a little bit different because you don't have necessarily the same effects on it, but you have revenue, you get tax stuff. You might not have intellectual property in the same way, but you will have, you know, potential fraud, erroneous management information, compliance issues, business interrupting problems that could affect the cities and municipalities and states. And our job is, again, to understand this stuff, put in place the processes and controls to manage and mitigate them through, again, that 9 box. And again, don't forget the control friction cycle, because if you have too much friction and you screw up the processes, they'll go around you and you'll think you'll control for risk, and in fact, you'll be driving them out of the controls and into a higher cost, higher risk state. You know, I've heard a lot of things in the tech sector, things like be bold, think big, act fast. That's a bunch of crap for me. Being bold means you're risking others. Acting fast, speed kills. NTSB proves that to us all the time. Think big, I don't know what that means. But I think we need to be brave. We need to be brave enough to hold ourselves accountable to these issues. We need to be brave enough to hold our organizations accountable to these issues, and we need to be brave enough to risk ourselves to do that. We got to think exponentially. The risks have been growing exponentially as computing has been growing exponentially, but we've been addressing the controls in a linear fashion. Hence the risk gap we've got. And we've got to act with purpose. And that purpose has got to be, what's the mission and how do we best achieve it in managing the risks. For me, it's always been about protecting to enable. Protection for protection's sake is a waste of money. So how do we protect to enable the people, the data, the business, the municipalities, the citizens, the cities, the counties? I've long believed that we need solutions, getting to my 9 box, that do 3 things. Create a demonstrable and sustainable bend in the curve of risk is a good security product. Just got to look around. We haven't done that in the industry. So I'm a former finance guy. Can't continue to throw money at the problem. And we're continuing to do that. Why? Because of the crappy solutions we have. And then the reactive response we need to throw on top of it. We need solutions that allow us to lower or flatten our total cost of controls. And then finally, we need something that addresses the control friction. If we can do that, then we've really accepted the responsibility for change. We've demanded of the industry what it needs to provide to us. And if we do that, we can unleash the opportunities in front of us versus have the potential harm that I showed with the stories that I told that are probable at this point because of our failure to think about them and design to mitigate the risks as best of our abilities and demand from the security industry solutions that help us do that. And we have to do that so that we can make tomorrow better than today. Again, I think the things that we're talking about with climate change and all those opportunities, they exist. But they won't exist, and tomorrow won't be better if we carry the same risk curve we have today into the future over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. So with that, thank you. And we probably have a minute or two, and I'm open to any comments, questions. Or not.
Okay, so I do have a question.
Yep.
You know, sitting here thinking about, okay, so what, and I'm not a security guy either, I'm a privacy guy. But I'm thinking, okay, so we have bad solutions, right? We put together systems that really aren't working right. But I'm not sure. You know, so out there are all these vendors that are trying to sell, and you're going, I don't know what to get, and I don't know what works well together, and so on. I was thinking about an analogy going back to, forgive me, the 70s, and thinking about a great stereo system. And how do I find the right amp and the right preamp and the right tuner and the right turntable and the right speakers that all make beautiful sound? Because I can buy good stuff, but do they all work together?
Yeah, it's a great question.
And make really good music.
And when you've got 1,600 security vendors out there, all claiming to be the latest and greatest thing, plus the entrenched guys that are throwing their marketing dollars saying they've got the best stuff, how do you cut through the crap?
And there's no one place that is like the gold standard that has everything together.
Right. And I think, but that's true in the. Yeah, well, that's true in the entire tech industry as well, right? Because there's a gazillion vendors there. So I've always looked at it in those three things. As a finance guy, when I came in to run security and business continuity, not knowing any of the details, I'm like, what's the business outcome that the CFO, Andy Grove, the board want from me? My three business outcomes: a demonstrable and sustainable bend in the curve of risk, something that allows me to lower and flatten my total cost of controls, and don't disrupt the business. The business needs business velocity. So that notion of control friction. Those were the three business outcomes I was always searching for. And then for me, it was the recipe of when I'm looking at a solution or a stack of solutions, how does it fit on all of them? And not trying to do an infomercial on Cylance, but the reason why I left, one of the biggest jobs in the world for security that I had in the Fortune 500, making a ton more money, was because I finally found a solution that actually did those three things. I had been searching for my mythical hero solution forever. I could find things that would create a temporary bend in the risk curve. I could find something that would allow me to play with my cost of controls. I could find a few things that would allow me to reduce control friction. I think if you look at it, what's the business outcome? Get out of looking at the technology. Say, what's the business outcome I need to achieve? Then start looking at the application of technology and process into that. And then see how it plays itself out on those curves. And then that will be your recipe for figuring out what works together and what doesn't. And where you can quilt things together, and it might not look pretty, but the quilting results in all those three things, because you're never going to find a one-stop shop. I mean, IBM tried for years, right? A lot of companies do. And in some cases, that enterprise suite, even if you go to productivity applications, right? People are going best of suite, best of breed. You still see that. Do we go Office 365 that way? Or do we go get Fuse over here for this, and Slack over here for that, and Amazon over here for this, and Workday over here for that, and Salesforce over there for that? I got IT, trust me. I deal with that side of that dilemma, but I still bring it back to what are the business outcomes, and then based upon the business outcomes, I can make an easier decision on best of breed, best of suite, and then make point-by-point solution evaluations. Because at the end of the day, I got to deliver a result. And though I'm in a business, and that might be easier to measure, and many of you are in cities, counties, departments, you still have a business result. If I'm the head of technology for the police department, what's my business result? You know, boots on the ground, effective information, effective policing, or response times, or whatever, right? So you can still measure the outcome that you're trying to do to support the fire department or the police department, or the city works for, you know, lights and power and parks. So I think that's, again, acting with that purpose. Understand the purpose of that department, and then apply the technology in a way that, and the controls in a way that creates cohesion towards that purpose, not friction against it. Frank, and then I think that'll be the last one.
What's your perspective on Apple's approach and philosophy on identity management with the new iOS 10?
You know, I think the evolution of where they're going with that is going to be interesting. I mean, I certainly like the fact that you can, again, the notion of control friction. I've got a fingerprint on there. It's a little bit easier for me. It now sees me, and so the facial recognition stuff becomes the unlocking mechanism. I think those things are great approaches to it. At the same time, and I think they generally do a good job of this, it's the back end of how you actually do that that says whether or not that will be truly effective, because I can't change my fingerprint. I can't change my face. Well, I could, but I wouldn't necessarily want to, though some might want me to. But you know, again, biometrics, I can't change it like I can a password. And so the back end mechanisms of protecting that need to be strong, because once that digitized information is out, it's like my social security number. I'm not going to change that. It's like the Equifax thing. Everybody's talking about it's the most significant risk to the consumers. It's like, that's crap. My data was already exposed 10 times over in the past 3 years. The Equifax thing's barely moved a needle on me for information risk. Now, it doesn't mean things shouldn't have been done better, but again, it really gets to certain things that can't change. Once they're known, you've already tipped the scale on the risk.
I'm thinking more of their retaining the data locally in a diversified portfolio versus a centralized database, because you see a lot moving towards the centralized, the Equifax equation. Localized.
Well, that's privacy by design. And again, going back to the security solutions, most of the security solutions out there are bulk collecting all your machine data, shoving it to their cloud, sometimes sharing it with others and exposing it. It's also why I like the Cylance approach. Our data stays local. We don't do that in our approach and how we apply the controls. And so I think that's the right design. They've figured out, you know, they're attempting to figure out how to do both, and having that be local helps with GDPR. Now, again, most of you probably don't have to necessarily deal with that, other than the fact that in your cities you might have EU citizens that are here on expats, in which case you're going to have to apply GDPR principles because you have European citizen data. So I like that localization approach as much as possible.
So given that it's now an endpoint that you pointed out, how and when do you address it with agents that can protect a mobile device?
Those are coming. I mean, we're on Linux, Microsoft operating systems. We're on Mac operating systems, Android's in flight. You know, iOS, you know, that becomes one of those items with Apple. But again, they've done a good enough job. DISA, the Department of Information Systems, they provide some of the standards for the DoD and stuff. They've basically said, you know, the iPhone model as it is good, and you don't need additional security controls. They just need to meet, you know, particular standards in the civilian area. So I think they're doing a pretty good job. And again, hopefully that'll continue. But, you know, eventually, if they open that up a little bit more, yeah, it's a possibility, but not at this point. And I think with that, I'm getting the hook.
Sorry. You got another group trying to come to the next one, but.
Thank you.